Hello again. In our last lecture we talked about Lipner's model, and the idea of Lipner's model was to take Bell and LaPadula and BIBA integrity and kind of shoehorn commercial security into that model. And that sort of worked pretty well. But we saw that there were a few wrinkles with that approach. Today we're going to talk about a different approach to commercial security, commercial integrity in particular, proposed by David Wilson and David Clark in 1987. And what they said was, sure, you can do that. I mean, you can take military security and stuff commercial security into that framework, but maybe that's not the right thing to do, because there are concerns that you have in commercial security that are not really specific to military security. So perhaps we should come up with a model of commercial security which is specific to that domain. In particular, what they said is one of the main concerns in a commercial environment is what they call consistency. So if you think about a bank, for example, one of the main things that you care about in that context is that the money that you have at the end of the day is some function of the money you had at the beginning of the day plus what came in and what went out. Balance, double entry balance ledgers and that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of concern that you just can't really talk about within BIBA integrity. Okay, so Clark and Wilson said, well, let's look at the things that we care about in commercial security. For example, authentication. We really care about knowing who each person is that takes actions within the system. An audit. We want to know what each person did and keep a record of it, which is inaccessible to them so they can't change it, in such a way that we can go back and figure out what happened and also assign blame if we need to do that. There's a notion of well-formed transactions. So for example, if you go into a bank and you hand the teller a check, there ought to be certain procedures that happen so that money gets debited from some account or credited to some account, and the cash drawer gets balanced and all those kind of things. And finally, separation of duty, which we've talked about before. Within commercial organizations, often you need different people operating in such a way that they can perform one activity. So for example, in a bank, if you go and ask them to cut a large cashier's check for you, you may need two different bank officers to sign the check. Okay, so the model that Clark and Wilson came up with is in terms of the following sets of things. You have a set of constrained data items. That is the things that you really care about. For example, stuff like bank balances and checks and things like that. And then you have a set of unconstrained data items. Those are the things that you're not as concerned about. For example, if you walk into a bank and you take a piece of candy from that bowl sitting on the counter, nobody needs to audit that activity. You have a set of transformation procedures, which are the steps which have to be taken to make sure that things balance after a check is cashed or an account is opened or something like that. And then you have a set of integrity verification procedures, and those are the procedures by which you look at these transactions to see whether they maintain consistency of the state of the system. Okay, and so Clark and Wilson came up with a number of rules, a whole bunch of rules actually, some called certification rules and some enforcement rules, and here's some examples of those. So one of these verification procedures, for example, must ensure that the constrained data items are in a valid state whenever you run one of these verification procedures. So it's a way of looking at the state of the system and deciding whether things are consistent at the current time. A transaction procedure must be certified as preserving the integrity of the system. Assignment of transaction procedures to users must satisfy separation of duty, whatever that means. The operation of transaction procedures must be logged. And if you have a transaction procedure that operates on some unconstrained data items and somehow affects constrained data items, then that has to be legitimate. And then there's these enforcement rules, like only certified transaction procedures are allowed to change things within the system. Users must only change things by means of a transaction procedure for which they're authorized, and the identity of any user has to be guaranteed. So you have to have authentication within the system. And then the way that the access control system is modeled is sort of traditional. We have a set of triples which says that a user can perform some particular transaction procedure on a set of constrained data items. If you think back to our earlier talk about access control policies, you'll see that this is a little bit like some we've seen before. One of these triples is a subject, an action, and an object. In this case, a set of objects, but it's just a more general framework. Okay, so the idea then is if some user wants to perform an action, it has to be the case that that action is in the form of a transaction procedure, and it can only be performed on certain sets of items or objects within the system. Okay, so what have we said? Well, Clark and the Clark-Wilson model, what they did was identify a set of concerns which were specific to the domain of commercial security. And these are things like, consistency, authentication, and audit. And they proposed a set of mechanisms by which these concerns could be preserved within their system. And their policy actually is very abstract, and so they have the set of rules about transaction procedures and constrained data items. But if you want to apply this within the context of a particular commercial environment like a bank, you've got to figure out what these rules mean and how you instantiate those things. Thank you.